guys, welcome to our new chapter. This is one of my favorite ones. This is chapter 23, which is all about the digestive system, which as you can guess by the name is all about food. Now, who doesn't love a good meal? Anyways, in this chapter, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the different organs and glands that are involved in the ingestion, digestion, and absorption of our food molecules. Basically, we want to see how we go from consuming a meal to ourselves being able to extract the energy and the nutrients from the monomers in the food that we consume. So let's go ahead and let's get started. All right, so here's just a general overview of some of the organs that you're going to take a look at as we cover the digestive system. Obviously, the way we're going to handle it is we're going to follow the path from beginning to end. And as we are looking at our food entering our body, we want to concentrate on which organs and glands contribute to the process, and obviously also how the food is broken down for nutritional value. So go ahead and take a look at your diagram on your right-hand side. And what you're going to notice is that when we do our digestive system, we're going to go ahead and start with the mouth and the oral cavity. We're then going to follow the food as it goes into the pharynx, down the long esophagus tube, and as it passes through the esophagus tube, it's going to go from the thoracic cavity into the abdominal cavity, into our stomach, which is this huge muscular sac, and from the stomach, we're going to take a look at what happens within all those coiled up tubes you see, which will be your small and your large intestines. We're also going to take a look at how the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas contribute to the process of food absorption and digestion. Now, within the entire digestive system, you're going to notice that there are 4 functions that will always come to light. You will have ingestion, digestion, absorption, and defecation. Ingestion is literally the act of you consuming your food. So you are chewing on your food, you are swallowing your food. So what goes into the tongue moving the food around, what goes into the process of getting the foods from the oral cavity into the pharynx, into the esophagus. And then your second step will be digestion. Now that you have the food in your GI tract, how do we go ahead and take these large molecules and how do we hydrolyze them? How do we break them down? So for instance, how do we take something like a carbohydrate and break it down into the simple sugar so that the individual cells can get the nourishment and the energy out of it? The third part will be absorption, and this is probably one of the most important steps of the digestive system. Absorption is the process of taking the nutrients or the monomers from your food and actually allowing them to leave the GI tract and enter into the bloodstream. So on your PowerPoint it says absorption is the uptake of nutrients into blood or lymph, mostly blood, and the reason this step is so important is because this is when the nutrients will leave the digestive system and actually circulate throughout your entire body, making sure that individual cells get access to the monomers and the nutrients. Now, what do you do with the food that could not be broken down, that could not be absorbed, that you could not use for? Well, that's going to be your waste product, and that will be step number 4, will be defecation. So we'll talk about the fact that your body, if it can't utilize the food or it can't digest the food, then it's basically going to package it up very neatly, and out it goes in the form of fecal matter. When it comes to our digestion, as we start talking about our different organs and our different glands, obviously our main goal is to break down the food in small enough pieces that we can get the nutrients out of it. And we see this is mainly done through 2 processes, either what we call mechanical digestion or chemical digestion. Anytime you see mechanical digestion, I want you to think that we're physically trying to break apart the food. So imagine that you just took a bite of a burger. The fact that your teeth are like chomping down on the bread and on the meat. The fact that your tongue is kind of moving the food from side to side so that it can make contact with more of your molars in the back. That's all an example of a physical breakdown, so that's a mechanical digestion. The fact that when the food gets into the stomach, that the stomach is going to chur or twist and mix and allow your food to make contact with the different juices inside of it, the movement of the stomach, the movement of the intestines, that's all example of a mechanical digestion. So using a physical entity to break the food into smaller particles. Now, mechanical digestion would be plenty to get us nutrients, but it would take a really long time. So that is why we're also going to utilize chemical digestion. Chemical digestion means that you do hydrolysis with the help of enzymes. Enzymes are bioactive catalysts, meaning that they're going to they will speed up chemical reactions, and most of the time they speed up chemical reactions by lowering the amount of energy that we need to invest in it. This means that you can get to your product faster and you can enjoy the benefits of it at a quicker rate. So part of what we need to discuss is what type of enzymes does our body need to produce in order to take large things like polysaccharides, which are like our carbs, and break them down into monosaccharides, simple sugar like glucose. What type of enzymes do we need to take proteins that we have in like meat products and break them down into their building blocks of amino acids? How do we break apart fats, lipids, into glycerol and fatty acids? And as we'll discuss the enzyme, you're going to notice that it can come from different parts of the digestive system. So on your PowerPoint, it says right here, you can get your enzymes from your saliva, from your stomach, from your pancreas, and even partly from the intestines. We're going to discuss which enzymes come from where and in which environment they'll have optimal reaction rates. And obviously, if you've learned anything about enzymes before, you know that they're very specific as to which substrate they can activate. So we have to talk about examples of enzymes that will be for the carbohydrates, that'll be for the proteins, that'll be for the fats. But before I get ahead of myself, anytime you see the use of enzymes, that will be an example of chemical digestion. As we're also going through the process, you're going to see that in order for us to complete all of our 4 steps, so our ingestion, our digestion, our absorption, and defecation, we're going to definitely need to utilize certain processes. So for instance, motility is a really big one. How exactly do we get the food to pass all the way down the esophagus, through the stomach into the intestines? So what type of muscular contractions are we going to be using? Also, how are we going to mix the food when it's sitting inside the stomach so we can have a little bit of mechanical breakdown occurring? How do we mix the enzymes along the way? We're also going to take a look at where these enzymes are coming from, which I'd mentioned to you before. So the secretions are very essential to the digestive system because they're going to speed up they're going to speed up our breakdown of our macromolecules into monomers, and obviously it will allow for our individual cells to get nutrients faster. And last but not least, we're also going to have to take a look at membrane transport. This will be the actual process of allowing the nutrients to leave the GI tract and enter into the bloodstream so it can go over to the individual cells. Alrighty, so back to our picture that we started this lecture with. One thing I wanted to mention to you is, and I've said it a few times, when you hear me say the GI tract, that's the gastrointestinal tract. It's your digestive tract. If you think about your digestive system, it's basically one long tube that starts with the mouth and ends with the anus. So the entry point and the exit point. And along that tube, what we see is that we're going to encounter our different cavities. So I'd mentioned this before, but let me just go ahead and remind you. When you look at the flow of food, and this is the way that the chapter is going to get set up, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with the mouth into the oral cavity. Then we're going to go into the pharynx, which is the back of the neck. And now we're going to go from the pharynx into the esophagus. And the esophagus is going to lead us over to the stomach. And from the stomach, we're going to go into our small and our large intestines until we finally get to the end point of the ride, which will be the rectum, and the exit point will be the anus. And this GI tract on average is about 30 feet long. That's crazy. Many of us aren't taller than 6 feet. So imagine that your entire GI tract is 30 feet long. And most of this will come from the coiled up small intestines and large intestines, and it's basically coiled up and all packed into that abdominal cavity. I will also be mentioning what we like to call accessory organs. Accessory organs basically contribute to the GI tract, but they're not officially part of it. So this will be things like your teeth, your liver, your pancreas, some of the glands that we require for our saliva production. Alright, so what exactly are the layers that make up our GI tract, our gastrointestinal tract? Well, there are 4 layers, and as you can see from the little insert right here, I've highlighted for you the 4 ones. Starting from the innermost layer, the one that forms the lumen, the opening inside the GI tract. This is where the food will come into contact with the actual cells. This is called the mucosa layer. Your mucosa layer is a combination of stratified squamous epithelium as well a little bit of muscle mixed in together. And like I said, this will be the innermost layer. This will form the lumen. Then you have a submucosa layer that usually is filled with different glands, so it's going to help us with some of our secretions that we require to keep the movement going. And then your third layer is the most important layer. This is called your muscularis externa layer. Your muscularis externa layer is going to do the bulk of the motility. So its contraction force is what's going to allow the food to move from beginning to end. And in a little bit, we're going to discuss the fact that you have both circular and longitudinal layers of muscles. Circular layers means that they're laid in a circular pattern, and that's really good because that's going to allow you to do constriction and dilation of the lumen. So it's going to allow you to kind of like segment, open and close the lumen. The longitudinal layer is going to lie in a longitudinal pattern, and this is going to be good for moving the food down the chain, down the GI tract. So for instance, moving the food from the stomach into the small intestines, from the small intestines into the large intestines. And then the outermost layer is a thinner layer. This is serosa. It's really more like areolar tissue, thin connective tissue. This is really good for kind of suspending the GI tract in place. And oftentimes it will also be an anchoring point for some of the blood vessels that are involved. A really unique fact of your digestive system is that it is completely independently able to control itself, so it does not rely on the central nervous system for its motility. So on your PowerPoint, I wrote down that you have this thing called enteric nervous control, and the enteric part basically hints at the fact that your esophagus, your stomach, and your intestines are able to induce their own contractions, and they're able to function completely independent of the central nervous system. I should also add that the central nervous system will contribute, it will add its kind of feedback, and it will help regulate its movement. But your digestive system can do this completely by itself. And it's due to the fact that within the esophagus, the stomach, and the intestines, we have 2 nerve networks. We have what we call the submucosal plexus. That one is going to concentrate on the secretions that we rely on for like our enzymes, for our mucus, and also it's going to help us in our muscularis mucosa layer, which is what we find within the lumen of the GI tract. Your second network is going to be your mesenteric plexus. Your mesenteric plexus is going to take care of what we call peristaltic movement. Peristaltic movement is wave-like smooth muscle movement. And this wave-like movement is what we're going to use to allow the food to move down the GI tract. You're going to see that peristaltic motion pop up in quite a few slides. And if you give me a few, I'll show you some illustrations to kind of show you how we use these muscle contractions to kind of guide the food as it's traveling down the GI tract. It will also, the mesenteric plexus, will play a role in the contraction of that middle layer of your GI tract, the muscularis externa. Remember, that's the bulky muscle layer that's going to allow for both circular and longitudinal control of the movement of the food within the tract. Now, here is what we like to call the lesser and greater omentum. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the picture on the left-hand side. And I've highlighted for you the section that's labeled the greater omentum. And the greater omentum is this fantastic connective tissue layer that's full of adipose tissue. So you guys see all those yellow lines? That's nothing but adipose tissue. And within that adipose tissue, we see little nodules, little pockets that usually have white blood cells. So it kind of plays a role in our immune system as well. But the main purpose of this like apron, this greater omentum, is to provide this protective layer that will shield our small and our large intestines. In fact, if you take a look at the illustration on your right hand side labeled B, you can see that if the greater omentum is lifted, you'll get a full view of your small intestines coiled up and your large intestines that kind of frame it, the abdominal cavity. You also have the lesser omentum. The lesser omentum, if you go back to the left-hand side, if you look up by the stomach, you're going to see it. It is going to be the connective tissue that's going to allow your stomach to anchor to your liver. Here is a look at the omentum from some cadaver models. So you can see it. You can see the top part of the abdominal cavity is removed. You can see your little diaphragm muscle, and then you see the omentum. And on the picture on the right-hand side, you can see that the omentum, the apron is kind of extracted, so you could really see how large it is. And it really does look like an apron as it covers your intestines. It is also part of your visceral peritoneum. So peritoneum is your connective tissue sheets that protect your organs. You might remember that we talked about it when we did the heart and when we did the lungs. We talked about the fact that it has a parietal and a visceral lining that will reduce the friction. It will compartmentalize it. So we see that your digestive system also has a peritoneum, also has a connective tissue sheet that covers it. And the largest part of the visceral peritoneal is going to be the greater omentum. Now, please don't confuse the omentum with mesentery. Mesentery is going to be a little bit thinner connective tissue. It's going to be filled with blood vessels. And what we do mesentery for is mesentery will be a great way to hold together or to coil up our small and our large intestines. So go ahead and take a look at the picture that is on the right hand side, and I've highlighted for you the mesentery, and you can see that it's holding together a bunch of the small intestines. You can also see that it's anchoring within the large intestines, and notice all those blue and red lines. Those are the arteries and the veins. Some of you might remember from our chapter on the blood vessels that you had to identify the mesenteric arteries and the mesenteric veins. So those are the blood vessels that are embedded within this very important connective tissue. So to kind of summarize, your omentum will serve almost like an apron, whereas your mesentery will keep everything nicely coiled up, and it will have blood vessels embedded within it as well. As we start looking at our digestive tract and we start kind of moving down from the mouth into the esophagus and the stomach, etc., you're going to also notice that I'll talk about exactly what regulates this motion, and it will be a combination of obviously its enteric control, the fact that it has the different plexus that can control the glandular secretion and the muscle movement by itself. So as you can see right here on my PowerPoint, it says you'll have neural control, so your mesenteric reflexes with the glandular secretion will help us with swallowing. We also have a vagovagal reflexes. This one is linked to our parasympathetic system. This one also will help with motility and secretion of different enzymes. But along the way, we're also going to rely on some hormones and paracrine secretions. And the hormones will often allow distant targets to communicate with the GI system, in essence to tell them when nutrients are required or to kind of give a heads up that nutrients are heading this way. And paracrine secretions, those are localized secretions that will travel to nearby target cells. So it's just a way for the cells in the digestive system to communicate with each other. Alrighty, so let's start our journey of food with the oral cavity. Alright, so as you can see from the illustration right here, we have a mouth that is opening up wide, and we can go ahead and we can see the cheeks and we can see the lips. As you can imagine, within the cheeks and the lips, within your oral cavity, excuse me, this is going to be an essential space for us to introduce our food to our teeth so that we could start doing our mechanical digestion. We also see that we have a vestibule, which is the space between the teeth and the cheek. And that space is going to allow us to move the food side to side as it's being manipulated by the tongue. I've also highlighted for you the lips. The lips have what we call a cutaneous and a red area. The cutaneous area is informally known as the mustache area, so where you would grow a mustache, and the red area is the lipstick area. So that would be your actual lips where we would apply things like our lip gloss or our lipstick. The tongue itself can also be found in the oral cavity. The tongue is a very strong muscle. It is very sensitive because it's filled with papilla and little taste buds. Taste buds are modified epithelium cells that are able to detect the food as it enters into the oral cavity and start setting up cascading reactions like the production of saliva and different digestive enzymes. We also see the hard and the soft palate. Now, the hard and the soft palate, aka the roof of your mouth, is very important because it's going to allow us to separate the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. We don't want our food mixing with the air that we're inhaling through the nasal cavity. And as you guys might remember, you have your hard palate towards the anterior, towards the front, and then you have your soft palate in the back. And in addition of separating the oral and the nasal cavity, it will also give us the benefit of being able to continue to breathe while we're chewing our food. And keep in mind that when you swallow, because of the size of your tongue, for that millisecond, you actually don't inhale. We discussed that before in our respiratory system. Also, what I want to point out for you, and I've highlighted it for you in your illustration, is all the way in the back by the soft palate, you have this little extension that kind of dingles down. It's called the uvula. And the uvula notes the end of the soft palate, but what's going to happen is when you swallow the food, the uvula along with the soft palate will go ahead and extend backwards into the pharynx region, the back of the throat region, and it will block the food from going upward into your nasal cavity. So it will kind of allow the food to go nowhere else but downwards on its way over to the esophagus. I also highlighted the palatine tonsils, and really the reason I highlighted the palatine tonsils is because a lot of times people will think that the uvula is actually a tonsil. It's not. The palatine tonsils are more towards the side, and obviously they're paired. So I just wanted to make sure that I showed you the difference between a tonsil and the uvula. Now, when it comes to our teeth, I mentioned to you before, it's going to be our example of mechanical digestion. We have baby teeth and adult teeth, and I always get asked, why exactly do we need two sets of teeth? And part of that is all about growth and our diet. So we are not born with the size jaw that we will have as adults. So what we see happening is initially we start off with our baby teeth, and as we start getting introduced to more and more food, so we migrate from like baby food to quote unquote more complex food, more chewing is required. And also we see that our jaw starts to increase in size as we grow. We see that we kind of lose the need for our baby teeth. So the roots of them will start to dissolve. And as the roots dissolve, we see that they're replaced by our adult teeth that start pushing upwards. In fact, what you can do is go ahead and take a look on your left-hand side towards the bottom. We see our little skull, and you can see the little astrages that have been marked on the adult teeth. And you can see how they're kind of pushing right underneath the adult teeth, and this can happen because the roots will start to dissolve, so the tooth will start to wiggle, and it falls out, and then of course you have to contribute to the tooth fairy. Make sure that you leave some coins underneath that pillowcase, right? Either way, with the teeth, usually what we see is that you have different forms of teeth depending on what the function is you would like them to contribute to. Towards the front, you have more of incisors, which are more for like tearing into food. And then as you go towards the back of the jaw, you're going to notice that the teeth become a little bit more flatter. They have a larger occlusal surface. And that is then when we take a look at our molars. Our molars are more for grinding our food. So usually what we see is that the food by the incisors, that is benefited by moving your teeth up and down, whereas the food that makes contact with the molars, it's benefited by moving the jaw side to side, like in a grinding motion. Now, when it comes to chewing, we like to call that mastication. The whole purpose of it is obviously to break down the food into smaller parts, but we also want to go ahead and as we're breaking it down, we want to increase the surface area that the food has so it makes it easier for the digestive enzymes to come in and assist with hydrolysis. The actual act of chewing is a perfect example of mechanical digestion, and we do see that we have this thing called a chewing reflex. And the chewing reflex basically says that the minute you introduce food into your oral cavity and it comes into contact with either your tongue or your buccinator or the orbicularis oris, which is that circular muscle that goes around the lips, we start seeing that when those items are activated, we start manipulating the food, and it will go ahead and recruit other muscles like the masseter and the temporalis to go up and down, crushing the food, and also your pterygoids, which are behind your jaw, to swing the teeth side to side to have more of a grinding action. To assist the food in increasing its surface area and exposing it to digestive enzyme, we're also going to go ahead and see that we're going to mix it with saliva. And the main purpose of saliva is obviously to moisten the food, to make it easier to kind of break it down. But we also see that within the saliva, we are going to have some of our digestive enzymes. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the statements that are on this PowerPoint. All right, so let's see. So we have the pH of saliva is pretty neutral, 6.8 to 7. It is a hypotonic solution, mostly water. And then as you can see, there are a few important items that are mixed in there. The first two are examples of some of our digestive enzymes. So we have our salivary amylase. Amylase is going to be an enzyme that's going to help us with carbohydrates or starch digestion. Lingual lipase, that's going to be an enzyme that's going to help us with our lipids. But what's interesting about this enzyme is that even though you mix it in your saliva in your oral cavity, the enzyme actually doesn't become activated until it reaches the stomach because it requires an acidic environment. I'll talk more about that. We also see that it has mucus. Mucus keeps everything nice and moist, makes it easier for you to swallow. And then we do have some immune functions within the saliva because we see that we have lysozymes, which are enzymes that can go ahead and kill off bacteria. And we have antibodies, immunoglobulin A, which will also assist with bacterial growth inhibition. So if you've ever heard of the 5-second rule, so that's my little cartoon, you can see the ice cream fell and the little police germ says, no, we have to give them the 5-second rule. It turns out that there is some truth behind that because within the saliva, you do have some entities that can inhibit bacterial growth. Although I wouldn't recommend the 5-second rule, but either way. So where exactly does all this saliva comes from? Because most people can produce anywhere from 1 liter to 1.5 liters per day. That's a lot of saliva. That's a lot of water that we need to filter out from our body to utilize. Well, it turns out that you have both extrinsic and intrinsic cells that can produce saliva. So on the illustration, what I've done for you is I've highlighted the 3 large glands that will contribute to over 90% of your saliva production. Those are going to be the parotid gland. As you can see, it's by the side of the masseter, closer to the ear. You have your submandibular gland, which lies a little bit by the jaw, and then you have your sublingual gland, which lies underneath the tongue. And between the parotid gland, the submandibular gland, and the sublingual gland, you'll be able to produce the majority of your saliva. You also have what we call intrinsic production of saliva, and that basically means that you have smaller patches of miscellaneous cells that can secrete saliva as well. This usually is a very small amount of saliva, but they're there, so I have to tell you about it. But the parotid, the submandibular, and the sublingual, they'll take care of most of what you require. We also see that these glands are often activated by both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. And depending on which one activates us, it'll give us a different quality of saliva. So let's go over to the left-hand side of our slide, and let's go ahead and take a look at the blue section. And it says, within the medulla and the pons, if your parasympathetic system activates saliva production, your saliva will be thin with lots of enzymes. So this would be the saliva you produce when you are actively eating, or if you're anything like me, you're thinking about food, you're smelling food, you're seeing food, you're looking up food on your phone to order. Anytime you find your mouth watering just thinking about food, that is the thin saliva that's rich with enzymes. That's the parasympathetic stimulation. If the sympathetic nervous system kicks in and produces saliva, this saliva will tend to have lots and lots of mucus. So it will tend to dry out your mouth. It's what people call cotton mouth. We usually get it when we get really nervous. Like for instance, if you're not a fan of public speaking and someone's like, okay, go ahead, start talking to the class, you're going to notice that your mouth gets really dry all of a sudden. And that is because of the sympathetic stimulation of the saliva production. Heavy on mucus, not a lot of water, so it dries out the mouth. Now, once the food has passed through the oral cavity and we've manipulated it with our tongue and our teeth, then what we're going to see is we're going to swallow. And as it swallows, the next area it's going to hit is going to be the pharynx. We've seen the pharynx before when we did our respiratory system. It's the back of the throat region. Remember, it's divided into 3 sections. The nasopharynx, which deals with your nasal cavity, the oropharynx, which is directly behind the oral cavity, and the laryngeal pharynx, which is going to go ahead and pass the larynx, where your voice box is. I do want to add that within the pharynx, which is skeletal muscle, you will have what we like to call constrictors. Constrictors are basically circular formations around the lumen that will allow to open and close the opening of the tube. You have a superior, a middle, and an inferior pharyngeal constrictor. And think of them like sliding doors. They will open and close the lumen, and this will be an excellent way to guide the food downwards so that there's one-way flow as the food starts to move from the oral cavity down into the pharynx on the way to the esophagus. Now here is your esophagus. Now there's lots to say about the esophagus. First off, it's a very long muscular tube. It is a combination of skeletal muscle in the upper part and smooth muscle in the bottom. This is important to highlight because skeletal muscle means that you have voluntary control over it. Smooth muscle means it's involuntary. So this is, for instance, what we see most of the time. This involves like little kids where they'll sit and they'll chew something and they'll swallow, and all of a sudden they'll decide they don't want it anymore, and up it comes and they spit it out. The fact that they can bring the food back up, that means that it was in part of the skeletal muscle of the esophagus. If the food falls down any further into the smooth, then only when you induce retching or vomiting will it allow the food to go upwards. Now, another thing about your esophagus, it is the only organ that extends from the thoracic cavity into the abdominal cavity, so it will actually pass through the diaphragm. In fact, the diaphragm has a little hiatus, a little opening that will allow the esophagus to pass right through it and connect over to the stomach. So let's see what I wrote down for you. I said it extends from the pharynx, which is the back of the throat, to the cardiac stomach. The cardiac stomach is the top part of the stomach, and it does so because the diaphragm has the hiatus, the opening. It does have a little inferior pharyngeal constrictor that we're going to be utilizing. We want to make sure not to have a lot of air come into the esophagus. And we see that towards the end, it has a lower esophageal sphincter. And this lower esophageal sphincter, the sphincter is also like a constrictor, the circular muscle tube to open and close. Well, at the end of the esophagus, you have a little sphincter because the environment in the esophagus is neutral, where the stomach is very acidic. So you want to have a way to kind of close off the two different environments and allow the food, once it passes from the esophagus, to sit in the stomach and not come back up. In fact, if the food from the stomach starts to migrate upwards down the esophagus, again, that is then when you get that heartburn sensation. That is the acidity of the stomach introducing itself into the neutral environment of the esophagus. I also wanted to highlight something else on your diagram. Notice how I put a little star next to the trachea because I wanted to remind you that, remember, your trachea sits in front of your esophagus. And the trachea with the C-rings has the little trachealis muscle in the back of it that will allow the smooth tube of the esophagus to kind of lean on it and allow the food to fall behind it all the way down into the stomach. In fact, when we take a look at the process of swallowing, we see that there are three phases that are going to be helped out by coordination with the medulla and the pons. You're going to have what we call the buccal phase, aka the oral phase, the pharyngeal phase, and the esophageal phase. So go ahead and take a look at the illustration that's on the right-hand side. And highlighted in green is the food that you are chewing. And as you can see in the first part, in our oral phase, it's all about the tongue manipulating the food, allowing it to mix with the saliva, coming into contact with the teeth, and eventually the food is going to be pushed towards the back of the oral cavity. And at that point, we see that the soft palate and the uvula will go ahead and will block the oropharynx and will allow the food to slide into the oro and the laryngopharynx. The second step is the pharyngeal phase. And the pharyngeal phase, what you see happening here is that we're going to go ahead and we're going to allow the food to slide with the help of the pharyngeal constrictors to slide into the esophagus. And what's going to help us along this way is the fact that your epiglottis is closed off, so the food cannot enter into the glottis, into the trachea. As the food passes down the pharynx, it will go into the last phase, which is the esophageal phase. And the esophageal phase basically highlights the fact that you're going to rely on that peristaltic motion, those smooth wave-like contractions, to allow the food to move all the way through the thoracic cavity and enter through the little hiatus into the abdominal cavity and finally into the stomach. Now, on the side, because I want to make sure I mention everything to you. Let's see, I wrote down for you pharyngeal and esophageal phase. We see that the soft palate rises. It blocks the nasopharynx. We don't want the food to go up in the nasal cavity. We're going to use some of our infrahyoid muscles to lift the larynx, the voice box, so that the epiglottis can fold back. And the reason why is because we want the food to go into the esophagus, not into the glottis, which would lead us over to the trachea. No food in the lungs, right? And also what we see happening is at this point, instead of calling it food, we're going to call it bolus. Bolus is chewed up food. So if you see the term bolus, that means that you have chewed up the food and you have actively swallowed it. And now as it's moving down from the pharynx into the esophagus, we're calling it bolus. Next step will be our stomach. All right, so a lot of people think that the stomach is kind of like our highlight of the digestive system. It's the one that does most of the work. And I'm here to tell you that is a lie. The stomach is nothing but a muscular sac that is going to allow for an excellent storage unit for our food to kind of sit and wait for its turn to make its way into the small intestines. And the small intestines is really will the majority of your digestion and absorption will occur. So why do we need the stomach? Well, we definitely want to have it as a storage unit because it allows us to have a nice meal in one sitting. Without the stomach, you would basically have to eat like minute amount of food throughout the day. So think of like a little small container of baby food. You would basically only be able to chew and swallow enough food that can directly make it into the intestines. That's no fun. So instead, we eat a larger meal and it kind of sits in the stomach. The stomach is going to be filled with acidic juices. These acids will have different functions that we'll talk about in a little bit. It will also allow us to start breaking down our food with the help of our different protein and lipid enzymes. And as the bolus is sitting in the stomach, it starts to kind of fall apart a little bit more. And at this point, we're going to call it chyme. So as food gets chewed up and swallowed, it becomes bolus. And bolus travels down the esophagus into the stomach. And when it sits in the stomach, then bolus becomes chyme, which is like a soupy mixture. Now, I did ask at the bottom of the slide, I said, can you live without your stomach? And the answer is yes. There have been lots of studies that shown that if we were to remove the stomach, you could go on and lead a healthy, productive life. The only thing is that you would have to make a few adjustments to your eating patterns because you can't have a large meal in one sitting because you lose that storage unit. And also, there's one thing that you would miss that you would definitely have to adjust. And that is that the stomach produces this glycoprotein called the intrinsic factor. The intrinsic factor is what allows our body to absorb B12, which is a very important vitamin that we need for DNA replication and red blood cell production. So people who get rid of their stomach, and a lot of times they'll do this in case of cancer. A lot of the cancers that develop in the stomach are very aggressive. There's also a high link to genetics to it. So there's been studies done where entire families have tested positive for the gene and they've decided to remove their stomach. What we see is that those patients would have to keep an eye on their B12 levels, and oftentimes they will either have to inject the B12 directly into the bloodstream, or the B12 will be introduced underneath their tongue, because underneath the tongue you have very thin tissue that makes direct contact with lots of blood vessels so that your body could still have the vitamins. So to make a very long-winded explanation short, can you live without your stomach? Yes, but you would have to supplement the way that your body gets B12 because you won't be producing intrinsic factor anymore. Here is a look at the anatomy of the stomach. If you look towards the top right-hand side, you're going to notice that I've highlighted for you the fundic region and the cardiac region. Those are the top parts of the stomach that come in contact with your esophagus. You're also going to notice that it will start widening out in the body, and it will have lots of rugae, that's the texture on the inside. That's going to increase the surface area that the stomach has to mix the chyme with its gastric juices and digestive enzymes. And then towards the end of the stomach, you're going to have what we call the pyloric region. The pyloric region is going to be tapered because it's going to make way for the pyloric sphincter. And this muscular circle is going to open and close and allow small amount of chyme to leave the stomach and go into the duodenum, which is the top part of the small intestines. The reason it has to be regulated is because your stomach is a very acidic, whereas the small intestines are neutral environment. So we're going to have to make sure that we neutralize the chyme as it leaves the stomach and it goes into the small intestines. So here it is written out. It says the stomach is a muscular sac. The volume can vary anywhere from 50 mLs to 4 liters. Because it's a muscle, it will stretch depending on how much you use it. So for instance, when people have gastric bypass surgery, they will cut off the majority of the volume of the stomach so that you basically go back to the baby size. And people are not able to hold on to a lot of food, which means that they eat less and then they lose a lot of weight. However, what we see happening is that if they don't maintain their healthier eating patterns, if they start overeating again, over time the stomach will start to stretch out again, and eventually it will get large enough that it consumes high amounts of meals with a lot of calories, and there comes that weight back again. It is a storage unit. It's the most acidic part of the body. We talked about the part that you have the cardiac region that's towards the top. The body is the main portion, and then towards the end you'll have your pyloric region with your pyloric sphincter. And the pyloric sphincter, as I said, is going to help you regulate movement of the chyme as it goes from the acidic environment of the stomach to the neutral environment in the small intestines. Here is the cadaver model of the stomach. Look at all that gastric rugae. So those are all those textured lines that you see on the inside, and it's all about increasing that surface area. And then also what you could see is you could really see the muscular ring in the pyloric sphincter. Look how it tapers out the end part of the stomach. So it really narrows out how much of the chyme can leave the stomach in one sitting. Imagine if you didn't have the pyloric region, right? So the food would come from the esophagus, it would get dumped into the stomach. If the food would just straight go from the stomach in the small intestine, you would have that heartburn sensation every single time that food migrated, because heartburn usually means that you go from an acidic to a neutral environment, and the acids are burning the neutral lining when they get through it. So that's why that sphincter is so important, because it's going to help us regulate and neutralize the acidic chyme as it's being secreted in small quantities as it moves from the stomach into our small intestines. Now, another question that I often get is, if the stomach is so acidic, why doesn't it just destroy itself? I mean, it has a very low pH. Some stomachs are as low as 1. Usually it's between 1 and 2.5. So why doesn't the stomach just not pulverize from all that acidity? And it turns out that the stomach will have a combination of different cells that will prevent this from happening. One of the cells are mucus cells. Lots and lots of mucus will be secreted, and the mucus almost serves as a protective layer that lies between the acidic gastric juices that are being secreted in the lumen, or the body of the stomach, and the actual cells that make up the stomach. We also see that the stomach will have lots of regenerative cells. These cells are a type of stem cells that are continuously producing new cells. So as the cells become exposed to the acid and they get damaged, we see that they're quickly replaced with a new lining. We see that we have what we call parietal cells. Parietal cells are actually the ones that will secrete the hydrochloric acid, which will make the acidic environment, and it will also produce that intrinsic factor that I mentioned to you before that we require for B12 absorption. We also see chief cells. Chief cells get their name because they're the most common cell in the stomach. They are going to be secreting pepsinogen, which is a precursor of pepsin, which is a protein enzyme. And during our infancy years, we also see that they help us produce trymosin and lipase, which will help us with the milk products and the milk fat that we consume during those months, if not years of our lives. We also have some cells that are labeled enteroendocrine cells. These are going to help with hormonal and paracrine secretions within the stomach. All right, so back back to that hydrochloric acid. So when the stomach produces hydrochloric acid by the parietal cells, we see that we require that acid for many different things. Obviously, it will be the contributing force to the gastric juices. It'll be the contributing force to the acidic environment. But we also see that we need that acid to activate the pepsin that's being produced by the chief cells. And we also need it to activate the lingual lipase. The lingual lipase is the enzyme that you found in your saliva that was being introduced in your buccal cavity. So that enzyme is actually not activated until it reaches into the stomach. And it's only then that the enzyme becomes active, that it starts breaking down the fats in the food that you are chewing. Pepsin is obviously going to focus on the protein that you introduced in the bolus or the chewed up food that's making its way into the stomach. The hydrochloric acid will also help us with breaking down the connective tissue and plant cell walls. Plant cell walls are filled with cellulose, which is a carbohydrate that's very tough to break through. So the hydrochloric acid will start attempting to break it down so we can get the nutrients out of the plant products that we're consuming. It will also help with our iron ingestion so that we have enough for our hemoglobin synthesis. And because it's an acidic environment, it goes without saying that it will help us get rid of any type of bacteria or pathogen that has made its way over to the stomach. So it's another way for an innate immune system to kind of kick in and protect us from any foreign entities. Now, I know I've said it before, but as you can see right here, now it's printed on your slide. It says another thing that your stomach will produce will be your intrinsic factor. And as I said to you before, this is the only thing you would miss if you were to get rid of your stomach. And that's because it allows us to absorb B12, which we need for our DNA replication and our red blood cell production. Usually, if you are low in your B12 absorption, it will cause you to become anemic. So it's a very essential vitamin to have. So the intrinsic factor will help with that absorption. And I've mentioned it before, but in case you don't produce intrinsic factor or you lose your stomach, you would then have to inject the B12 directly into the bloodstream, or you would take it underneath your tongue where it can easily diffuse through the tissue and come into the blood vessels that are over there. We also see that we had our pepsin that was being produced in the form of pepsinogen. And then now we talked about the fact that the pepsinogen, when it gets mixed with the hydrochloric acid, it becomes pepsin. And pepsin will be an enzyme that we use for protein digestion. And then we also talked about the fact that you had gastric lipase and chymosin. And I'm sorry, we didn't talk about the gastric lipase. We talked about the lingual lipase. But we also have gastric lipase, same concept. Lipase will help us break down our lipids. Gastric lipase just means that it comes courtesy from the stomach. And that lipase, along with chymosin, we usually only produce those during our infancy period. And that's because it's associated with the milk product and the fat that we have from consuming our milk products. Now, when it comes to gastric motility, we do see that we have what we call a swallowing central. These will allow signals for the stomach to start relaxing, and this is basically in the moment of contemplating that food is going to fall down from the esophagus. So this swallowing center will go ahead and allow the stomach to stop stretching very briefly and relax more so that we can hold the food. And as the food enters into the stomach, we see that we have a group of cells called pacemaker cells, which will start initiating the peristaltic motion, allowing the stomach to start churning and having this like ripple-like contraction allows for the mixing of the gastric juices, which is now where you have a combination of your mechanical digestion, the actual movement of the stomach, and since we're introducing our enzymes in the juice, in the bolus, and in the chyme, we also have a little bit of chemical digestion going on. And we do see that the contractions will get a little bit stronger as we get towards the end of the stomach where the pyloric region is, and that is because we're going to start ejecting small amount of chyme into the duodenum, the top part of the small intestines. And the average meal takes about 4 hours to process. It obviously depends on what you're consuming. Now, sometimes things go wrong, and instead of going downwards, the food will kind of reverse and go upwards. And this is where we have good old-fashioned vomiting that occurs. Vomiting can be induced by a wide variety of different items. It could be something as simple that we kind of overate, so we just excessively stretched our stomach. Sometimes you will have a stimuli that will kind of upset you in a physiological or a chemical type of way that will basically have an irritant feeling that will induce the medulla to start retching, which basically is when you find your throat, you kind of feel your throat moving upwards. A lot of people will say that they'll have like this watering sensation, and you'll have this feeling that the food is making its way up. Part of that is because the sphincters will start opening it up, making it easier for any type of food content within the esophagus and even the stomach to move upwards, along with the fact that your abdominal muscles and the smooth muscles in the esophagus will start sporadically contracting, forcing the food upwards. And unfortunately, that can eventually lead us to vomiting when the force is strong enough to eject the food out of the GI tract. In our last PowerPoint for part 1 of our digestive system, I wanted to show you a picture of a normal versus a unhealthy mucosa. Remember, your mucosa is your innermost lining. It's the one that will form the lumen. And as you can see on the left, it's nice and healthy. And on the right-hand side, you can see there's a little peptic ulcer. So an ulcer, think of an ulcer like an internal wound, right? And what we see happening is if anything aggravates the mucosa, it's going to start bleeding on the inside, and that will cause lots of inflammation. And also what you see is all that redness that's caused by massive inflammation. The dark spots are basically clogged up blood that's sitting there. We have some mucus that's starting to generate. It's not a good sight. Now, a lot of us, when we see that we're having issues with our mucosa, so for instance, we're having heartburn, we're going to go ahead and we're going to reach for that Pepto-Bismol, right? And Pepto-Bismol is basically like a pink liquid Band-Aid that will cover the surface of the mucosa, so it will allow us not to get aggravated, and it will protect that sensitive mucosa layer, so it gives your immune system a little bit of time to heal it up. Now, for most of us, this will be, a once in a while occurrence. Maybe we ate something that's really spicy or that just aggravated our digestive system and we needed some Pepto-Bismol. For some of us, we see that we are just continuously having this problem and no amount of Pepto-Bismol is making us feel better. And for those of us who have that issue, I'm going to recommend that you go ahead and you get yourself checked out, because a lot of times what we see happening is that you might have a bacterial infection. And that is why I inserted that little picture on the bottom left-hand side. That is Helicobacter pylori, which is a bacteria that is infamous for finding a home right in your esophagus, right when it gets introduced into the stomach, and it basically starts chewing on your mucosa lining, and it aggravates the little sphincters, and because it's aggravating the mucosa lining, you are continuously having this irregular, uncomfortable feeling every time you're consuming food, and Pepto-Bismol will not help you. In this case, we're going to need some good old-fashioned antibiotics to help us on the way. And once the bacteria is killed off by the antibiotics, then the healing process can occur so that you won't have any more side effects. All right, guys, I will see you soon for part 2.